The claims investigator called me directly, not my sister, on a Tuesday afternoon in March. And the first thing she said, before she even introduced herself properly, was that she needed to confirm I was the recorded title holder of a farmhouse on Milligan Ridge Road in Blount County, Tennessee, a property my sister had been insuring under her own name for the past 3 years without ever once mentioning to me, or apparently to the insurance company itself, that she didn't actually own it. Before I tell you how this happened, let me take you back. If you've ever discovered that someone in your own family had been quietly rewriting the facts of your life without telling you, I think you're going to feel this one in your chest. If you do, go ahead and hit like on this video, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because there's a lot more to this story than a burned kitchen and an insurance form, and I promise you it gets more complicated before it gets resolved. My name is Grace Holloway. I'm 41 years old, and I work as a licensed property and casualty claims examiner for a regional insurance carrier based in Knoxville, Tennessee, which means I spend my professional life doing exactly the kind of work that ended up unraveling my own family's situation, reading policy documents line by line, verifying ownership records against county recorder databases, and asking the single question that most people never think to ask until it's far too late. Which is simply, does the person filing this claim actually have a legal right to the thing they're claiming? I've spent almost 17 years in this industry, and if there's one lesson it has taught me more than any other, it's that insurable interest, the legal requirement that you must actually own or have a financial stake in something before you can insure it, is not a technicality. It is the entire foundation the whole system is built on, and when that foundation turns out to be missing, everything built on top of it eventually comes down, sometimes slowly, and sometimes, as I learned this past spring, all at once, in the middle of a family meeting nobody expected to end the way it did. I grew up the middle of 3 children outside Maryville, Tennessee, with a mother who worked as a school cafeteria manager, and a father who drove a regional delivery route for almost 3 decades before retiring early with a bad back. My older sister, Renee, is 44, married to a man named Dale Park who works in commercial insurance sales, of all things, and my younger brother, Marcus, is 37, lives about 2 hours away in Chattanooga, and has always kept a comfortable emotional distance from whatever drama happens to be unfolding in the rest of the family at any given moment, a habit I used to resent and have since come to understand a little better. The house at the center of this story belonged to my mother's father, a man named Cecil Holloway, who spent most of his working life as a foreman at a hosiery mill outside Maryville before the mill closed in the late 80s, after which he spent the next several decades doing small carpentry and cabinet work out of a shop behind his house on Milligan Ridge Road, a modest but sturdy farmhouse he and my grandmother bought in 1971, and which he continued living in alone after my grandmother passed away when I was in my 20s. That house, over the years, became the fixed point our whole extended family orbited around: Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, the place where every cousin learned to ride a bike in the long gravel driveway. My grandfather was a quiet, exacting man, the kind who measured twice and cut once in every part of his life, not just his carpentry, and that same carefulness, I would later learn, extended all the way to how he decided to handle the future of that house. I want to walk you through the years that led up to what happened this past March, because, as is true of most family stories like this one, the real damage was never a single event. It accumulated slowly, across more than a decade, in small decisions that individually seemed reasonable and collectively built toward something none of us fully understood was happening, until an insurance investigator called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon. When I was 29, my grandfather was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease, and over the following several years, his hands, the same hands that had spent a lifetime doing precise cabinet joinery, began to shake badly enough that he could no longer manage his own finances the way he once had. It was me, not Renee, who set up online bill pay for his utilities, who caught a Medicare billing error that had been quietly overcharging him almost $200 a month for nearly a year before I found it buried in a stack of unopened envelopes on his kitchen table, and who spent an entire Saturday on hold with Medicare's Regina L office untangling the mess and getting him a retroactive credit of just over $2,100. Renee, who lived 20 minutes closer to him than I did at the time, would stop by most weeks to visit, bring him a hot meal, and sit with him for an hour or two, which I want to be clear was genuinely kind and something he appreciated. But she never once in all those years asked to look at his mail, his bills, or his finances. And somehow, at every family gathering afterward, it was her visits that got described as keeping an eye on Dad. While the unglamorous work of actually managing his affairs simply happened, unremarked upon, in the background. When I was 33, my grandfather had a bad fall in his workshop that fractured his wrist and kept him from using his dominant hand for almost 2 months. I drove up from Knoxville 3 weekends in a row, a little over an hour each way, to help him with basic tasks, dressing, cooking, even something as simple as buttoning a shirt, all of which had become suddenly difficult with one hand out of commission. Renee visited during that stretch too, and I don't want to erase that from the story because she did show up. But I remember one particular Sunday when I arrived to find the kitchen sink full of dishes that had clearly been sitting for days, and when I mentioned it to Renee on the phone that evening, she told me she'd been so busy that week, but that she'd made sure to bring him his favorite pie on her last visit. My grandfather never complained about any of it. He simply adapted, the way he always did, and I think that adaptability, more than anything else, is part of what made it so easy for the rest of the family to underestimate how much quiet management his life actually required as he got older. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you've ever been the one quietly doing the real work while someone else gets to narrate a version of events where they're the devoted one, I want you to type the words, "I see you," in the comments right now, because somebody scrolling through this tonight needs to read that. There was also a specific financial episode, about 8 years ago, that I think matters to this story even though it doesn't directly involve the house. Renee and Dale went through a difficult stretch when Dale's commercial insurance book of business took a significant hit during a slow economic period in their region, and Renee asked our grandfather for a loan of $14,000 to help cover a gap in their mortgage payments, which he gave her without much hesitation, the way he tended to when family asked him directly for help. I found out about that loan almost by accident, going through his financial records the following year while helping him file his taxes, and when I asked him about it gently, he told me he didn't expect to see the money again and that he'd rather help while he was able to than leave Renee scrambling after he was gone. I never brought it up with Renee. But I want you to understand that detail, because it becomes relevant later, when the question of who had actually been contributing to my grandfather's financial stability, and who had been quietly drawing from it, became a great deal more important than any of us expected it to. The hidden piece of all this, the part that nobody in my family knew about, until an insurance investigator called me directly this past spring, started almost exactly 6 years ago, not long after my grandfather's Parkinson's progressed to the point where his neurologist began gently raising the subject of long-term planning, guardianship considerations, and what would eventually happen to his estate if his condition continued to advance the way these conditions typically do. My grandfather called me on a Thursday evening that autumn and asked me to come up to Maryville the following weekend, alone, without mentioning it to Renee or Marcus. When I arrived, he told me, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd once found his overdue Medicare paperwork, that he had already made an appointment with an estate attorney named Harold Vance, whose small practice was located in downtown Maryville, a few blocks from the courthouse, and that he wanted me to come with him. At that meeting, and over the course of 2 follow-up appointments spread across the next several weeks, my grandfather explained his thinking in detail, both to Harold and to me. He said he had watched, over the decades, more than one family in our community lose a home to exactly the kind of quiet confusion that happens when nobody is entirely sure who's actually responsible for a property as an aging parent's capacity declines. Disputes over who pays the taxes, arguments over who's allowed to make repair decisions, and eventually, sometimes, outright legal battles among siblings after a parent's death. When a house that everyone assumed was simply part of the estate turns out to be tangled in probate for years, he did not want that for Milligan Ridge Road. He told me plainly that he trusted me specifically because of my professional background, because I understood, in a way the rest of the family had never had reason to learn, how property, insurance, and legal ownership actually intersect, and because I had spent years quietly managing his affairs without ever once asking him for anything in return. We executed what's called a warranty deed with a reserved life estate, a legal structure that transferred full title and ownership of the Milligan Ridge Road property to me immediately, while guaranteeing my grandfather the absolute right to continue living in the house, exactly as he always had, for the rest of his natural life, with no change whatsoever to his day-to-day relationship with the home. The deed was properly drafted, signed, notarized, and recorded with the Blount County Register of Deeds, which made it a matter of public record from that day forward, searchable by anyone who thought to look, though of course almost nobody ever does, until they have a specific reason to. Harold Vance explained, during that first meeting, exactly why this structure made more sense than simply naming me as a beneficiary in my grandfather's will. A will, he said, only takes effect after death, and can be contested, amended, or argued over in ways that a completed, already recorded property transfer generally cannot. A deed with a reserved life estate, once executed, is essentially final. My grandfather listened to that explanation and nodded slowly, the same deliberate nod he gave when something matched exactly what he already believed to be true, and told Harold, "Then that's what I want. I want it finished, not argued about." I signed the deed. I did not tell Renee, I did not tell Marcus. For the following 6 years, my grandfather continued living in that house exactly as he always had, and I quietly took over responsibility for the property taxes, which ran a little over $1,100 a year given the modest assessed value of a rural farmhouse on several acres, and for periodic maintenance costs, a new water heater about 4 years ago, a roof repair after a bad hailstorm 2 years back, and a full septic system inspection and partial replacement 18 months ago that ran close to $7,000, all of which I paid quietly from my own accounts, without mentioning the amounts to anyone in my family, because the arrangement had never been about credit. It had been about honoring what my grandfather had asked of me, and about making sure the house he'd spent his whole life in would be protected, exactly the way he wanted it protected. What none of us fully understood, and what I did not learn until that Tuesday phone call this past March, was that roughly 3 years ago, not long after my grandfather's Parkinson's progressed to a point where his mobility declined significantly, Renee had taken over managing his day-to-day household bills, including his homeowner's insurance policy, which had been through a small regional carrier for as long as anyone in the family could remember. According to records I later obtained during the claims investigation, Renee contacted that carrier's local agent, a man she and Dale had actually met socially through Dale's own work in the insurance industry, and requested that the policy be renewed under her own name as the named insured and owner, rather than continuing under my grandfather's name, explaining, according to the agent's notes, that she was handling her father's affairs, and wanted the paperwork to reflect that going forward. I want to be careful and fair here, because I don't fully know, even now, whether Renee understood at the time that what she was doing amounted to representing herself as the legal owner of a property she did not own, or whether she genuinely believed, incorrectly, that managing my grandfather's affairs meant the policy should simply be reissued in her name as a matter of administrative convenience. What I do know, because I eventually saw the paperwork myself, is that for 3 consecutive years, the homeowner's insurance policy covering Milligan Ridge Road listed Renee Holloway Park as the named insured and the owner of record, a status that was never legally true, not for a single day of those 3 years. If any of this sounds like the kind of quiet, compounding confusion that can build up in a family over years, without anyone stopping to check the underlying facts, comment the word compounding below, because I think a lot of people watching tonight have seen exactly this pattern play out somewhere in their own extended family. My grandfather passed away this past January, peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 86, in the same bedroom he'd slept in for over 5 decades. The house sat largely empty over the following 2 months, while the family worked through the practical matters that follow any death. The funeral, the immediate estate paperwork, decisions about which of his personal belongings would go to which grandchild. Renee, as the sibling who had been managing his household affairs, took on responsibility for maintaining basic upkeep of the house during that period, checking in periodically, making sure the utilities stayed on. The kind of practical caretaking that made sense given the arrangement everyone, except me, believed was already in place. On a cold morning in early March, an electrical fault in the kitchen's aging wiring, something an inspector later attributed to decades-old aluminum wiring behind the stove that had never been updated, sparked a fire that spread through the kitchen and up into the attic space above it before a neighbor noticed smoke and called the fire department. By the time the fire was extinguished, the kitchen was a near-total loss. The attic and roof above it had sustained significant structural damage, and smoke and water damage had spread through much of the rest of the first floor. A contractor's initial estimate, obtained a few days later, put the total repair cost at just under $96,000. Renee, understandably devastated, and I want to be fair, genuinely believing at the time that she was the rightful policyholder handling a legitimate claim on a house she had every reason to think of as effectively hers to manage, filed a claim with the insurance carrier the same week, providing photographs, the contractor's estimate, and her own account of the property's condition and history. I want you to understand that I knew nothing about any of this, the fire, the claim, none of it, for almost 10 days, because Renee had not thought to call me, and because, as far as she knew, there was no particular reason she needed to. If you're watching this, and you've ever found out about something enormous happening in your own family several days after the fact, simply because nobody thought you needed to be told, comment the word sidelined below, because I think a lot of people watching tonight know that particular sting. The claims investigator who eventually called me, a woman named Patricia Yoon, worked for the carrier's Special Investigations Unit, the division that reviews claims above a certain dollar threshold, typically anything over $75,000 in a residential property claim, as a standard fraud prevention and verification measure before any large payout is authorized. This is not, I want to be clear, an unusual or suspicious step. It is simply routine procedure across the industry, the same procedure I myself have run dozens of times in my own career, and it typically involves confirming the named insured's actual legal relationship to the property, verifying the deed and title history through the county recorder's office, and cross-referencing that information against the policy documents on file. When Patricia ran that standard title search on Milligan Ridge Road, she found the warranty deed recorded 6 years earlier, showing full ownership transferred to me, with my grandfather retaining only a life estate that had, as of his death 2 months earlier, already expired according to its own terms, since a life estate ends automatically at the death of the life tenant. In plain terms, this meant that at the moment of the fire, the sole legal owner of that property, according to the public record, was me, and had been for the entire 3 years that Renee's insurance policy had listed her, incorrectly, as the owner. Patricia's call to me that Tuesday afternoon was, from her professional perspective, a routine verification step, exactly the kind of call I myself have made dozens of times to confirm ownership details before a claim can move forward. She had no idea, when she dialed my number off the recorded deed, that she was about to become the person who finally told me my own sister had been misrepresenting her legal relationship to my grandfather's house for the past 3 years. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever learned an enormous truth about your own family from a total stranger doing their job, someone with absolutely no idea of the weight the information carried for you personally? If so, comment the words, stranger's truth, below, because I think that's a very particular, very disorienting experience, and I don't think it gets talked about nearly enough. Patricia explained to me, carefully and professionally, that because the named insured on the policy, Renee, did not hold legal title to the property and therefore lacked what's called an insurable interest at the time the policy was issued and renewed, the policy itself was very likely void from its inception, meaning the carrier would almost certainly be unable to pay out any claim under it at all, regardless of how legitimate the fire damage itself was. She asked whether I had been aware of the policy being issued in my sister's name, N. D. Whether I myself held any insurance on the property. I told her honestly that I had no idea any of this had happened, and that I did not currently carry insurance on the house myself, since my grandfather had continued paying for coverage under what I'd assumed was still his own policy, right up until his death. That conversation lasted almost 40 minutes. By the end of it, I understood two things with complete clarity. The first was that my sister was about to discover, in the middle of dealing with a devastating house fire and a raw, recent grief over our grandfather's death, that the insurance claim she was counting on to fund almost $100,000 in repairs was very likely about to be denied entirely. The second was that I now needed to figure out, quickly, how to protect a house I legally owned but had never insured myself, since my own coverage gap had simply never occurred to me, given how the previous 6 years had quietly unfolded. I called Harold Vance that same afternoon, the attorney who had drafted the original deed, and asked him to pull a certified copy of the recorded document, along with a copy of the life estate language, so I would have everything organized and verified before I had to have what I already knew was going to be an extraordinarily difficult conversation with my sister. He emailed me the full packet within the hour, along with a short note reminding me, gently, that he had warned my grandfather years earlier that an arrangement kept this quiet for this long-carried real risk of exactly this kind of collision, and that he was sorry it had finally arrived under such painful circumstances. If you've ever had to prepare, calmly and methodically, for a conversation you knew was going to hurt someone you loved, even though you'd done nothing wrong to cause the situation, comment the words, bracing for it, below, because I think a lot of people watching tonight have lived through exactly that kind of dread. Renee called a family meeting for the following Saturday, at Marcus's house in Chattanooga, since it sat roughly halfway between where each of us lived and offered neutral ground for what she described, in the group text she sent, as figuring out next steps for Dad's house, and getting everyone on the same page about the insurance situation. I want you to notice, looking back, that even in that text message, she had already framed the house as Dad's, a house that legally had not belonged to our father or to our grandfather's general estate in over 6 years. I arrived at Marcus's house that Saturday with the packet of documents Harold had sent me sitting in a folder on the passenger seat of my car, along with a printed summary of everything Patricia Yoon had explained to me about the insurable interest problem and the likely denial of the claim. I had not called Renee ahead of time to warn her about any of it. I had thought about it more than once in the days leading up to that Saturday, but I ultimately decided that this conversation needed documentation and clarity behind it from the very first sentence, rather than a phone call that could easily spiral into confusion, defensiveness, or misunderstanding before either of us had the actual paperwork in front of us. Marcus's living room that afternoon held all three of us, along with Dale, Renee's husband, and my own husband, Tom, who had come along mostly for moral support and had, wisely, positioned himself near the kitchen doorway rather than in the middle of the seating arrangement. Renee began the meeting with a folder of her own contractor estimates, photographs of the fire damage, a rough timeline of the repair process she was hoping to coordinate, and she spoke for almost 15 minutes about her plan, once the insurance payout came through, to oversee the full restoration of the house herself, restoring the kitchen, repairing the roof and attic damage, and eventually, she said, discussing with all of us what makes sense long term. A phrase I understood, even before she elaborated. To mean a future sale of the property, with proceeds divided among the three of us, as though it were a straightforward inheritance. Dale, at one point, mentioned that they'd already gotten a preliminary verbal estimate from the adjuster on what the payout might look like. Somewhere in the range of $85,000 to $90,000, depending on the final scope of repairs, and that they were hoping to have a firm number within the next couple of weeks, so they could get contractors scheduled before the damaged sections deteriorated further from continued weather exposure. I let her finish completely before I said anything at all. I did not want to interrupt her plan, however painful I already knew it was going to be to correct, in the middle of her presenting it, because I understood, watching her that afternoon, that she genuinely believed every word of what she was describing, and I did not think cutting her off mid-sentence would serve either of us well. If you've ever had to sit quietly through someone else's confident plan, knowing the whole time that it was built on a foundation that didn't actually exist, comment the word, the weight, below, because I think that particular kind of restraint deserves to be named. When Renee finished, I told the room, as plainly and gently as I could manage, that I needed to share something important, and that I was sorry the timing was going to make an already difficult week even harder. I explained that 6 years ago, when Grandpa's Parkinson's had progressed to the point where he'd started thinking seriously about the future of the house, he and I had worked with an attorney named Harold Vance to transfer full ownership of Milligan Ridge Road to me, through a properly recorded warranty deed, while preserving his right to live there, undisturbed, for the rest of his life. I explained that this meant the house had not been part of Grandpa's estate for the past 6 years, and had never been something to be divided among the three of us through inheritance, because it had simply, quietly, already belonged to me the entire time. I opened the folder. I laid out the certified copy of the deed, dated just over 6 years earlier, my grandfather's signature clear and steady on the final page, notarized and stamped as recorded with the Blount County Register of Deeds. I laid out the life estate language, explaining, since I understood the concept far better than anyone else in that room, that a life estate automatically terminates upon the death of the life tenant, meaning my ownership had become full and unencumbered the moment Grandpa passed away in January. And I laid out, because I knew it needed to be said clearly and could not be avoided, the notes I'd taken from my conversation with Patricia Yoon, explaining that because Renee had never actually held legal title to the property, the homeowner's insurance policy she'd been paying for, and had just filed a claim under likely never had a valid insurable interest behind it, which meant the carrier was very probably going to deny the entire claim. Regardless of how real and how severe the fire damage genuinely was. The silence that followed lasted, by my own estimate, close to 20 full seconds, which is a very long silence when you're the one who caused it, and an even longer one when the person across from you has just watched an entire financial plan, and a piece of family history she'd assumed was settled, collapse in the space of a few sentences. Marcus spoke first, picking up the deed and reading it slowly, the careful way a person reads something they're trying hard to fully absorb before saying anything they might regret. He set it down and said, quietly, I remember Grandpa mentioning, a couple years back, something about wanting the house squared away properly before things got harder for him. I never asked what he meant. I guess I understand it now. Renee's reaction unfolded in stages, and I think it's worth describing honestly, because I don't think it would be fair to you, or to her, to simplify it. Her first reaction was disbelief, insisting there had to be some mistake, that Dad would have told her something this significant, that surely a family lawyer would have looped in more than one sibling on a decision affecting the house we'd all grown up gathering at. Her second reaction, once she'd actually read through the deed and the life estate language herself, was a kind of quiet, stunned math, working out loud, almost to herself, that this meant the insurance policy she'd been paying for the past 3 years had never actually been valid, which meant the claim she'd already filed, and the contractors she'd already started calling, and the repair timeline she'd already begun building in her head, all of it, might simply not be real. Her third reaction, which came several minutes later, was the one that struck me hardest. She asked, in a voice that had gone thin, whether this meant she could be in legal trouble for having insured a house that wasn't hers. I told her, as honestly and gently as I could, that I genuinely didn't know the full answer to that question, that insurable interest violations can range from an innocent administrative misunderstanding to something insurers treat far more seriously depending on intent, and that this was a conversation she was going to need to have directly with Patricia Yoon, and likely with her own attorney, sooner rather than later. If you've ever had to be the one who corrects the record in your own family, knowing it would hurt someone you love in order to stop a bigger problem from compounding further down the road, comment the word documents below, because I think that's a specific kind of loneliness a lot of people never get to name out loud. Dale, to his credit, given that he actually works in the insurance industry himself, was the one who asked the most useful practical question in the room, which was what our actual options were at this point, given that the house was sitting exposed to further weather damage with no valid coverage in place, and roughly $96,000 in repairs needed. That question, more than anything else said that afternoon, shifted the room from shock into problem-solving, which I was grateful for, because problem-solving was the one thing I actually knew how to help with. I told them what I had already started working through in my own head over the preceding days. As the actual legal owner, I could obtain my own homeowner's insurance policy on the property immediately, though any new policy would only cover damage occurring after the new coverage took effect, meaning the existing fire damage would not be covered under a freshly issued policy, since insurance, by its basic design, only covers future losses, not damage that has already occurred before a policy begins. This meant the fire damage itself, unless Renee's existing claim could somehow be salvaged or reworked, was very likely going to need to be covered out of pocket, through some combination of family funds, or, if it came to it, a home equity loan against the property that I, as the legal owner, would need to be the one to secure. I want you to understand that I did not know, walking into that meeting, that I was going to end up personally responsible for close to $96,000 in fire repair costs on a house I owned, but had never insured, because I had trusted, reasonably I thought at the time, that my grandfather's existing coverage was still active and would simply continue functioning the way it always had. I had walked into that meeting expecting to correct a misunderstanding about ownership. I walked out of it facing a financial problem considerably larger and more immediate than anything I had anticipated that morning. If you're watching this and you've ever had the ground shift under a decision you thought was solid, comment the words, "The ground moved," below, because I think a lot of people watching tonight know exactly what that feels like. I want to walk you through what happened over the following weeks, because, as with most situations like this, the resolution took considerably longer and involved considerably more moving pieces than any of us expected sitting in Marcus's living room that Saturday afternoon. Patricia Yoon's Special Investigations Unit completed its formal review of Renee's claim about 10 days after our family meeting, and the outcome was exactly what I had anticipated, though somewhat more nuanced in its final language than I'd expected. The carrier formally denied the claim, citing the lack of insurable interest at the time the policy was issued and at the time of loss, which meant no payout would be made under the existing policy. However, Patricia's final report also noted, and this mattered a great deal to how things eventually unfolded, that the investigation had found no evidence of intentional fraud on Renee's part, no indication that she had falsified her ownership status knowingly or with deliberate intent to deceive the carrier, and that the situation appeared, in the investigator's own words, to be a case of administrative misrepresentation stemming from a genuine, if mistaken, belief in the insured's ownership status, rather than deliberate fraud. That distinction, I later learned from my own professional experience, matters enormously because it meant Renee was not going to face a criminal fraud referral, though it did not change the outcome of the denied claim itself. And it did mean the carrier flagged her file for a period of heightened scrutiny on any future policies she might apply for through them. I hired a public adjuster, someone entirely independent from the carrier, to do a full professional damage assessment of the house within the same week, since I needed an accurate, defensible number before making any decisions about repairs, financing, or the property's future. The final assessment came in slightly higher than the original contractor estimate, at just under $101,000, once the adjuster identified additional smoke damage in the upstairs bedrooms that hadn't been fully accounted for in the initial walkthrough. I want to be honest with you about the financial reality of the following 2 months, because I think it matters to the story, and because I think too many of these kinds of stories skip past the genuinely difficult, unglamorous math that follows a moment like the one in Marcus's living room. I secured a home equity line of credit against my own primary residence in Knoxville, since the fire-damaged farmhouse itself had no equity available to borrow against in its damaged state, for $65,000, and combined that with savings I had built up over years specifically as a financial cushion to cover the bulk of the repair costs. Ray. Once the full picture became clear to her, and once several more weeks of processing what had happened had passed, came to me with an offer I genuinely had not expected, to personally contribute the $14,000 our grandfather had once loaned her, money she had never repaid to him directly, toward the repair costs instead, as her own way, she said, of trying to make something right. Even though she understood it didn't erase the underlying confusion or the stress the situation had caused. For Renee, the weeks following that Saturday meeting were difficult in ways that extended beyond the financial contribution she eventually made. She had to formally withdraw her name from the property's insurance and utility accounts, a bureaucratic process that took nearly a month of phone calls and paperwork, and she had to have an uncomfortable, direct conversation with the local insurance agent who had originally processed the policy change 3 years earlier. A conversation that, according to what Dale later told me, revealed the agent himself had never actually verified her ownership status against county records at the time. Simply taking her word for it, which was a lapse on his part that the carrier's internal review flagged separately from Renee's own culpability in the matter. She called me 3 times in the first 2 weeks after the meeting, and I want to be honest that those calls were not easy for either of us. In the first call, she was defensive, insisting she genuinely believed, based on how our grandfather had always talked about keeping things in the family and making sure everyone was taken care of, that the house was simply going to end up divided among the 3 of us eventually, and that she hadn't thought carefully enough about the technical distinction between managing his affairs and actually owning his property. In the second call, about a week later, she was quieter and told me she'd spent several sleepless nights turning over exactly when and how her assumption had solidified into something she'd never bothered to verify, and admitted that she couldn't actually point to a specific conversation where Dad had ever told her the house would be hers, only a general, comfortable sense she'd built up over years of being the sibling who lived closest and visited most often. The third call, about 3 weeks after the meeting, was the one that mattered most to me. She told me she'd been reflecting on the $14,000 loan Dad had given her years earlier, the one I'd never mentioned to her that I knew about, and said she'd realized, turning it over in her mind, that she had spent years thinking of herself as the child who was close to Dad, present, visible, involved, without ever once stopping to examine how much of the actual structural weight of caring for him, financially and legally, had been carried by someone else entirely. someone who had never once brought it up or asked for credit. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you've ever watched someone in your own family slowly work their way from defensiveness toward genuine reflection, comment the word, the slow turn, below, because I think that particular, difficult process deserves to be named too, not just the moment of confrontation that starts it. For Marcus, the aftermath was quieter than for either Renee or me, but not without its own small reckoning. He told me, about a month after the meeting, that he'd started thinking differently about his own approach to family matters generally, admitting that his habit of staying emotionally distant from whatever was unfolding among the rest of us had always felt, to him, like a reasonable form of self-protection, but that watching the entire situation unfold had made him realize that distance sometimes functions less like neutrality and more like quiet absence. A way of avoiding responsibility for asking hard questions simply because it was easier not to. He began calling me more regularly after that, not about anything dramatic, just ordinary check-ins, and I think that shift, small as it was, meant more to me than he probably realizes. Dale's role in the aftermath surprised me, honestly, more than almost anyone else's. Given his own background in commercial insurance, he became, in a strange way, one of the more useful people in helping the family actually understand what had happened and why, explaining insurable interest requirements to extended family members who called asking questions, and helping Renee navigate the process of formally correcting her insurance and financial records without the situation spiraling into something legally worse than it already was. I think, in his own quiet way, he understood exactly how easily this kind of administrative confusion happens, having seen it, professionally, in other families' situations over the years, and I think that professional distance actually helped him support Renee through the personal version of it with more clarity than either of us could have managed alone in those first difficult weeks. The repairs on Milligan Ridge Road took just over 4 months to complete, working with a contractor I selected myself after getting 3 competing bids, a process that felt strangely, appropriately familiar, given how many times over the years I had quietly handled exactly this kind of logistics for my grandfather, without anyone else in the family fully registering how much of it fell to me. The kitchen was rebuilt close to its original layout, at Renee's specific request, since she remembered, more vividly than I did in some ways, exactly where Grandpa had kept his coffee mugs and his cast iron skillet, small details that mattered to both of us in ways that went beyond the practical necessity of simply getting the room functional again. I want to tell you about one particular afternoon, about 5 months after that meeting in Marcus's living room, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Renee asked if she could come with me to Milligan Ridge Road to see the finished kitchen before I formally closed out the repair project with the contractor. We walked through the house together, mostly in silence, and when we got to the kitchen, freshly painted, new cabinets installed close to the original style, she stood for a long moment in front of the window above the sink, the same window Grandpa used to stand at every morning while his coffee brewed, and told me quietly that she was sorry, not just for the insurance confusion itself, but for years of simply assuming that her closeness to him meant she understood his wishes better than anyone else, without ever once checking that assumption against anything real. I told her I understood how the assumption had built up over time, and that I didn't think she'd set out to deceive anyone, that I genuinely believed, based on everything I'd learned through the investigation and through our own difficult conversations, that this had been a slow accumulation of misunderstanding rather than any deliberate attempt to take something that wasn't hers. I told her I appreciated the $14,000 she'd contributed toward the repairs more than she probably realized, not just for the financial help, though that mattered too, but because it was the first time in years that she had contributed something concrete and unprompted toward the actual, unglamorous work of caring for something that mattered to both of us, rather than simply the visible, easier parts of showing up. If you've made it this far with me, I want to leave you with something, because I think this story was never really about a house fire or an insurance policy, and I don't think the ones you're going to watch after this one will be either. For a long time, I believed that being the one who quietly handled the difficult, unglamorous work of caring for my grandfather, the bills, the paperwork, the deed, the taxes, would eventually be understood and valued by the rest of my family without my ever needing to say a word about any of it out loud. What I learned, sitting in Marcus's living room watching my sister's entire understanding of a piece of our family history quietly collapse under the weight of a properly recorded deed, is that quiet, careful stewardship doesn't announce itself. It has to be spoken, eventually, clearly, and with documentation behind it, or the people around you will simply build their own version of events on top of the silence you left available to them, not out of malice, but because silence, left alone long enough, tends to get filled in with whatever story feels most comfortable to the person filling it. I've also come to believe, in the months since, that my grandfather's decision to structure things the way he did wasn't really about protecting the house from any specific person. It was about protecting all of us from a version of this exact situation happening after his death, without documentation, without a legal record anyone could point to. A version where the confusion might never have been untangled at all, where Renee's assumption and my own quiet ownership might have collided in probate court instead of in a living room, with lawyers and years instead of a single difficult, honest Saturday afternoon. I did not raise my voice in that living room, and I'm still glad I didn't, because the quietest, most factual version of the truth is often the one that lands the hardest, and the one that nobody can argue with afterward. Dignity, in my experience, rarely looks like the dramatic confrontation people imagine when they picture standing up for themselves. It looks like a folder of documents, calmly placed on a coffee table, and a willingness to let the truth, and the people you love, work through the difficult math of it together, one honest phone call at a time. If this story meant something to you tonight, if any piece of it were me, ended you of your own family, your own quiet carefulness that nobody around you ever fully noticed, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are a lot more families and a lot more quiet truths still waiting to be told.